Welcome, listeners. We are back with another guest episode of the Inspired Writer Collective. Today, I'm here with Alyssa Brade, who lives with her husband and two toddler boys in the remote countryside of Washington State. With degrees and experience in English and anthropology, plus her own new mom level of research, she has brought us a new book. This is called Mommy Needs a Minute: From Burnout to Empowerment. And this is her self-published book about a number of different areas of burnout that moms, particularly new moms, experience. So we're going to talk with Alyssa today about why she felt led to write this book in the first place, what her writing process as a mom of two young kids looked like, and now as a published author, what that marketing piece is like for a self-published nonfiction book. So welcome, Alyssa. Thank you so much for taking time out of your, I'm sure, busy schedule to be here with us today, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm very excited to chat with you.
Awesome. So start us out. Tell us what it was about your own experience that led you to say, I need to write this down because I'm struggling and I know others are struggling too.
Oh, that's a great question. I think it all started when I first had my firstborn son, and I realized just how few protocols were in place for moms in particular when it came to support, and how exhausting and overwhelming it was. I feel I talked to a lot of new moms, and they expressed exhaustion, burnout, and it ended up leading to trying to do it all and be it all and manage it all, and how exhausting and overwhelming that was. So I had my firstborn son when in the middle of my master's degree program. I was working as well, and I was a full-time stay-at-home mom. We didn't have great childcare in my area. And then after I graduated, I found out I was pregnant again with our second. And so I was working, I was pregnant, I had a 5-month-old, I was really sick, and I was just pushing all ends of the spectrum, as far as work, mom life, trying to maintain my relationship with my husband. And felt really overwhelming. It ended up getting to a point where I got really sick. I ended up fainting, carrying my son down the stairs, dropping him. His head hit the concrete. He ended up getting internal hemorrhaging inside of his brain. The doctors told us he might not live. It was a quite traumatic experience. Long story short, he ended up being okay by some miracle. And I really equated that to I needed to get my priorities and my life together, and started leading me to question what in our society and what within me as a woman, as a mom, was leading me to push myself to such extremes, in order to be a good mom and to do it all and have it all.
That story is so beautifully written too in your burnout guilt cycle chapter near the end of the book, where you share that story of like holding your son while you're pregnant with your second child and all of that thought process that you share. I mean, you really put the reader like in that scene, and anyone who has been a mom can so relate to that level of guilt that you feel over those, accidents that invariably happen. I mean, our goal is to keep our kids alive, right? And there are some times where some things happen where we have these potentially catastrophic things that occur, and we like rake ourselves over the coals for it. I'll share, I had an instance, I think my daughter was 10 days old. I had wedged her in the corner of like a multi-piece sectional, so she was like far from the edge of the couch, and I was setting up her swing. I was literally right there, but I was turned away from her. And a baby who had never rolled and didn't roll again for another, I don't know, months and months and months. Somehow I turn around and she's on the floor. I mean, this is like a fall from a couch, like standard size couch. And I was absolutely mortified and felt all of the guilt and all of the emotions, and, asked my then wife for help, but also felt super guilty about the fact that like I may have just caused spinal cord injury or, something awful. And luckily babies are pretty resilient and flexible and are made to do some of those things. Their bodies haven't, solidified quite yet. And And so she was fine, but I could absolutely relate to the level of guilt that you portrayed in that story of, feeling like, oh, I tried to do everything I could. I tried to turn my body. I tried to do this and that and protecting this baby and this baby. And then just feeling at a loss of like, it's never enough. Will it ever be enough?
Yes, and I'm so sorry that happened to you. I feel like many women have stories along those lines of mistakes, accidents. You're human, you're exhausted, you're functioning on such little sleep and you're doing your best. And yes, that guilt, that soul-crushing guilt that you've just destroyed this young person's life that you were trying your best to pour everything into. I'm so happy to hear that your daughter is okay. As you know, I can very much empathize and relate to that feeling of overwhelm and helplessness.
So what did your writing process look like while you had these two young boys? You're this full-time stay-at-home mom. You do such a beautiful job of painting this picture in the book, but I won't spoil that for the listeners. So if you'll share with us, for our podcast audience, what did that look like? How did you carve out the time? And I believe you said you did this in like 12 months, getting this book written and out.
Yeah, so what I did for me was it was very important to treat writing as a discipline as much as it was something that I enjoyed doing. So I didn't just write when I felt inspired. I committed to a certain word count every day. It started out at 100 words and then I pushed myself to 500 words a day. And I would get up early in the morning. For some people, they're more night owls, so they do better in the late evening. But I did better in the early morning. I'd get up at 4 a.m. and I would write for an hour every day. Inspired, if the words came, if they didn't come, I forced myself to sit and write for at least an hour every day. Sometimes I wrote over the 500 words. Sometimes the 500 words were just gibberish. I was like, I'm going to have to go back and totally rework all of these. But it was that commitment and that dedication and that discipline is what really ended up helping me get to that point where at the end I was like, oh my goodness, I have a book and it's ready. And that time management to just take the time, whether you feel like it or not, whether you feel inspired or not, to sit down and write.
Yeah, in the book, you describe the scene of you in this parka with this little space heater in the basement, using a cooler as your table. And while that's not my writing environment, that's certainly a similar vibe to the environment I might use as a mom to like go eat a snack that I want to eat and I don't want to have to share with anyone little. So it was very relatable in that sense of like the way we as moms have to find those small little spaces that maybe aren't the most ideal environments, but it's what we've got. And it gives us that little bit of escape to have that time for ourselves, whether that's, you're talking into your phone, making a voice memo as you're on the treadmill at the gym that happens to have the free childcare, whatever that looks like for a particular mom. I think that's quite admirable that you took that approach and that level of discipline with your writing. That has not been something I've been able to implement very well. I started shifting to the 4 a.m. time frame because I'm much more of a morning person than a night owl. And my daughter decided she was also eager to get up just as early if she got any vibe that I was up. I don't know if we're just that well connected or whatnot, but she crept into that early morning time and I'm like, forget this, we're both losing sleep and I'm not getting anything done. But that's so admirable that you were able to focus that way and to be so diligent with your writing process. Did you find, just curiosity, that your like first draft is vastly different than your final draft, or were there just minor tweaks and changes and shifts? What did you notice about like your writing process or editing process?
So for a nonfiction book, I feel like it's probably different than a fiction book. I'm in the process of writing a fiction novel right now. So I would say the two processes, at least for me, are really different. The first draft of my nonfiction was my heart, and it was my stories and how I explored and worked through a lot of the areas of burnout in my life. So the first draft was very similar to the final draft. The only difference was that I went in for the final draft and I added in all the research I'd done. So I did a lot of research on my own before I even wrote the book to start working on my own self and understanding what was going on a social level. So I took a lot of different sources from sociology, anthropology, communication, and I looked at how all of these different factors influence motherhood and our perceptions of motherhood and our perceptions of ourselves, our identities within motherhood. And so I wrote the first draft with a lot of my personal experiences, personal stories, and the takeaways that I took. And then I went in for the final draft and I added back in where I found that research, what helped guide me to that conclusion. So that was kind of the process for the nonfiction. I feel like for fiction writing, at least in my opinion, it's been a really different experience. The first draft looks night and day different from the final draft. You probably wouldn't even think it's the same book.
Yeah, that could happen for sure. I think you did some really genius things with this book. For one, I love that you started with information burnout, and then you did not inundate the reader with information throughout the rest of the book. You know, you allude to the fact that, like, if you want to dig into more, here's the, citations and references in the back of the book. But also know that information burnout is a real thing that's going to hold you back, and lean into your intuition instead. And then you went a step further and provided the reader with what I think is the most genius piece of this book, which is the takeaways at the end of each chapter. So at the end of each chapter, Alyssa has clearly takeaways and then a number of bullets, usually no more than a page, of the key information that she wants the reader to have for each of these chapters. Now, as I was reading your book, what I ended up doing is I read the intro and the first chapter and got to the takeaways, and I was like, oh, great. I can save time. Let me just breeze through the takeaways of each chapter to see which ones I want to go back and read in full. And so, while I don't have, young kids anymore, I have a 5-year-old, that I'm still a busy mom trying to manage mostly stay-at-home mom life, plus the, podcasting and writing business. And so it was so helpful for time management to have these takeaways, because then I could flag the chapters I wanted to spend more time digging into ahead of this interview and this conversation, but also, like, of the ones that I was like, oh, I don't have a whole lot that I can relate to, or I feel like I've already learned a lot of these lessons through my own process. It was so easy to be able to really utilize this book as a tool, in order to figure out, okay, here's where I can relate, here's where I want to do a little bit more reading. And personally, because of my own experience, I spent some time in the identity and career chapter. And I wonder if you would be willing to speak a little bit about your own struggles with that identity and that career piece and the division of your time between wanting to have these achievements and also trying to be the kind of mother you wanted to show up to be, but not just be a mom.
I think that's such a great question, and one that I feel like a lot of women I talk to can really relate to. When I was really little, I told my mom I want an extraordinary life. And I told her, and I from a little young age, I didn't want to babysit. I didn't want to play baby dolls. I didn't want to play house. I was the explorer. And I was always the one going and the hero saving the day. And that was the games I wanted to play when I was little. I never wanted to be a homemaker. I never wanted to have children. When my boyfriend and I got together, I told him, kids are not in the cards for me. I don't want to have kids. And I was told by doctors that I'd have a really hard time getting pregnant. So they're like, perfect. This is it. No kids. I was very career focused. So was my then boyfriend, now husband at the time. We were both looking at careers that were 70, 80 hours a week, a lot of travel, and we were thriving. We were excited about this. So as I was finishing my master's degree, and I was preparing to send out my resumes, I found out I was pregnant right before COVID started, and I was devastated. I ended up calling my mom crying and just telling her, I'm never going to have that extraordinary life that I wanted. My life is over. And it took a long time to get to a point where I realized that my children are a beautiful addition to my life, but they are not the only thing that define my life. And I think I'd grown up with the role models in my life were women who they gave everything for their children. There was no them outside of their children. And everyone's careers got put on hold, and that's what you were supposed to do. And that was one of the biggest steps I took in my family, being the first one to say, oh, I might not want to be a full-time homemaker. I might not want to homeschool all of my children. I might not want to um, be give up my career and just watch my kids grow up and then not know who I am afterwards. I might not want that. And so starting to work through that, and also in conjunction, letting go of the guilt that comes with that guilt of feeling like you somehow owe your children everything, all of you, every part of you. And so you lose yourself in that, was a really big step to take. I think that you have your children and they only need you like they need you now for such a short time. So of course, prioritize them, give them the best parts of your attention and your mental energy and your physical energy and your emotional well-being. Um, but don't lose yourself or forget about yourself in the process. And that looks like things like writing a book or pursuing the career that you're still ambitious about, and being able to find the balance between knowing who you are and knowing that it's not going to look the same as it would if you didn't have any children, and that's okay. I think those are the two hardest aspects of motherhood for me, for sure.
Yeah, I definitely I mean, the choice to enter into motherhood was an intentional one for me. But when I became the stay-at-home mom, that was, I guess it was a little bit of a choice, but it was a forced leaving of my career. And then it became a what now? Okay, I guess I'll be the stay-at-home parent while my then spouse goes out and becomes the breadwinner. Whereas I had been the one going outside of the home prior to that. And certainly I had run into a number of struggles, which I am writing about in my own memoir about, how I had challenges facing my motherhood obligations, such as breastfeeding and pumping and everything, along with my going to work and being called out to crime scenes and just everything that I was dealing with and experiencing on a day to day. So it can relate in that sense, but definitely came at it from a different way where it wasn't so much a choice on my part as like, oh, I'm going to choose to leave my career to be the stay-at-home mom. It was like, I've left my career. Now I guess I'm going to be the stay-at-home mom because that's what my family needs from me. And I also felt that extreme loss of identity, especially since we that came along with a move, a relocation. And so losing that support system, losing that sense of community and having to like rebuild all of that, right? So I really love the advice that you give within the identity chapter. And I also love in this chapter how you take the time to talk about some of the things that is true about motherhood and is wonderful. Like motherhood is beautiful, it's life-changing. It'll fulfill you with your natural nurturing role. And then you go on to list an equal number of things that you weren't told that are also true about motherhood. Motherhood can be lonely, motherhood can be complicated, it can be monotonous and repetitive, and you would feel depleted balancing the role of mother and lover. And I love that you went there in these lists and are helping kind of normalize the fact that yeah, it's beautiful, it's great, it's one of the best things I've ever done, and it's also one of the hardest and one of the most draining and one of the things I have to be most intentional about because it feels so high stakes, but yet when you look back at it, it's almost like, does it matter if they ate an organic cracker or a regular cracker? They were fed, they were happy. They're not going to remember this. Why am I driving myself absolutely crazy, trying to be this, whatever this vision or what society paints as like the ideal mother role, right?
Yes, and I love that you say that and you talk about that too, because I feel like many women are there's so many different ends of the spectrum and so many different stories of you were kind of forced into the motherhood role and you're like, I feel extreme identity loss. And I feel like in some ways, sometimes when that happens, at least for me, I felt like the life I wanted or the life I'd been working so hard for was stolen from me. Like it was stolen from me and replaced with motherhood. And I wasn't allowed to grieve it because in doing that, it made me a bad mom because I didn't want my kids or I didn't want to be a good mom, or every mom wants to be a stay-at-home mom. There's women around the world who would give anything to be a stay-at-home mom. And so you should be extremely grateful and you shouldn't grieve the career you lost and you shouldn't grieve the identity you lost because this is something everybody wants. And I think there's that also that social element too that comes into play that makes you feel guilty about losing that piece of yourself or that part of your life you've worked for some people for decades. And there's that element of guilt that is like, no, I think we need to normalize the fact that it's okay to grieve a loss. And that is a loss, whether it is being replaced with something just as beautiful. It doesn't mean that it's not hard to let go of that piece of your life.
Mhm. And I noticed it most within my social circles because being the stay-at-home mom, and I don't know if you experience this too, especially being in a remote area like you are, all of my socializing then became defined around being a mom too. So it's like all the groups I was spending any kind of time with, I was there because I was a mom, right? And so it was like I wasn't able to exercise any portion of my identity outside of being a mom. It was like this play group or this thing, and you just hope you meet other parents there that also have similar interests to you outside of, their child rearing practices and beliefs, but it can be really difficult to find even those social connections outside of that mom identity. Everything becomes just so, I don't know, just singular in the fact that it's all around being a mom.
It's true. And I love that you say that because I think even our conversations are, even my spouse, I have to be like, we're not talking about the kids right now. We're talking about us and what we want and what we like and how your day was and how my day was outside of just our children. And I feel like I can really empathize with that, even in the, like you said, your identity becomes centered around mom life. So your conversations are all about your kids. And I had this conversation with my spouse. I was like, most of the people I hang out with, my friends, don't even realize who I was or what I did. Nobody knows if I have a degree or not, what I did outside of my children, who I was outside of my children. Sometimes some of my friends get a little over her, a little comment or something, and they're like, you have that. And it's amazing to discover how little you know about your friend group when you're a mom outside of their parenting preferences and what snacks they give their toddlers.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to take this conversation away from our roles as moms and the various burnouts and talk about, as a writer and as a now published author, what has it been like? What are the difficulties, challenges, new areas of growth and learning around marketing this book? And I ask this specifically because so many writers pinpoint the marketing of the book as one of the reasons why either they want to go the traditional route or they don't want to write at all. And you self-published this book, so I'm very curious about how you have viewed the marketing, how you view the long-term plan for this book, and just your experience as an author.
I think I would agree with you. Marketing was the most intimidating part for me. Writing the book was easy in comparison. Figuring out Amazon's KDP, and figuring out which formats to do and the ISBN numbers, and then figuring out how to bring it to market in a way that reaches my target audience was exhausting. I think that the biggest takeaway that I could give people is not to be afraid to start. If you wait until you're going to do it perfectly, you will never do it, because there is no perfect way to do it. The information is always changing. The audience is changing. What might work for one author won't work for you. I had fiction author friends who are fiction writers, and they told me all these incredible tips, wonderful tips that had helped them build their book sales exponentially. None of them worked for me. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that their tips were wrong. It just meant that my demographic, my book was different. As a nonfiction book, I had to market it a little differently. I could go into specific tips or specific advice that worked well for my book. But I think the thing I would love to tell is you have to do it and you learn through trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody loves to hear. If you want to wait till you do it perfectly, you can't do it. because there's so much to learn and there's so many things that you're going to do wrong. And if you view those failures as incredible lessons to learn and to grow instead of as setbacks, if you adopt that growth mindset, then there's nothing that you won't be able to become successful in if you just pushing it and learning and growing. Taking away from those failures and setbacks all of the incredible lessons that you can apply and pass down. And if you look at successful people, everyone who's ever been fails way more times than they succeed. The big consistency throughout so many people's lives is their dedication and resilience to stick with it and to keep doing those small dedicated steps. So my goal is I don't do all of the marketing things. I don't do everything perfectly. I tackle one small area and I do one small, sustainable, manageable, imperfect every day, whether that be a small one, whether that be an amazing conversation with Elizabeth. I choose one small thing and I connect with the incredible people in my audience who are interested in my book. And I don't stress or worry about the millions of other things I could do that might reach millions of other people, because it's too exhausting and overwhelming. And when I do that, I don't have the motivation to even start or try because I'm too overwhelmed. So for me, I just focus on one small thing and I do one step at a time. And connecting with other authors, other like-minded people like Elizabeth is such a great way to network and encourage each other and gain more tips as you're in the industry. I think one of the hardest things to do is to gain tips without actually having a book published because it's hard to see how it's going to play out and the dynamic, and you don't have anything concrete to go off of. You just have other people's stories that you're trying to write your own story based off of. And when you do that, you have an incomplete story.
Gonna sound so cliche, but it feels so apt, and it's what the analogy that's coming to my mind as I'm hearing you talk. Not only are you mimicking, the discipline that you had with your writing, with your marketing now, but it makes me think so much about parenting as a whole and about how you have to treat each kid uniquely, just like you have to treat each book uniquely. And certain marketing things that work for even you as an author with your nonfiction book may not work for you as an author with your fiction book. That's a different book, a different kid, a different thing you have to approach. And you, as the guardian of it, have to decide what's going to be best for it. And maybe you try something and you see if it works, and maybe it does or maybe it doesn't. And then all the advice that you hear, you still have to filter through that lens of, is this right for my book? Just like you would as a parent filtering through, well, is this right for our family? Is this right for my child? Is this, co-sleeping method better? Or is this other, cry it out method better? Or what kind of bedtime do I want? What works with our family? You have to filter it through that lens, using that intuition, using that insight, and that knowledge that you have because you uniquely know your book, you uniquely know yourself as an author, and making sure that you're doing what represents you and the book best. And so it's exactly what we try, to do as parents. So, if maybe writers will, writers who are parents will make the best, marketers, who knows? But I just had to, I know it's cliche, but I just had to put that analogy out there because that's what was kind of ringing in my head of like, oh, yeah, I don't have a book I have to market yet, but I'm familiar with what Alyssa's saying. But I'm familiar with it in a like getting all this information and all this advice lens of parenting, and then having to decide, okay, what's going to work for me? What am I willing to try? What resources do I have? And how can I utilize those to best serve, this project?
I love it. I love that you brought it full circle because I do think just like with marketing your book, just like with parenting, you can waste so many resources on things that aren't appropriate for you or right for you or right for your child or your book. And you can spend time, money, energy doing all the things that work for other people, and you keep hitting dead end walls because they don't work for you, and then you get frustrated, and instead of thinking something's wrong with the method you're using, you think that something's wrong with you. So I would encourage you not to get to that point. There's nothing wrong with you. There might be something wrong with the method that you're using, and it might not be authentic. People are attracted to what is authentic. Your children will be attracted to what's authentic. Authentic parenting that comes from who you are, whether it goes with what everybody else is doing or not, is always more attractive and sustainable than a role that you're playing or a mask that you're wearing. And I would say the same thing with marketing. You need to choose a marketing technique that is authentic to who you are as an author, that's sustainable for you, and that is authentic to what your book is and the message of your book, because that will appeal to way more readers than all of the other millions of things that you can try stretching yourself too thin.
Exactly. So, Alyssa, thank you for being here today. Listeners, grab a copy of her book off of Amazon, Mommy Needs a Minute. We will have Alyssa's links to social media and everything within the podcast episode notes. Again, thank you for being here, Alyssa, and have fun with your boys today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye.